In a gilded hall echoing with centuries of conquest, King Charles stood before a crowd of diplomats, monarchists, and world leaders. The chandeliers above him glittered like imperial crowns, casting light over velvet tapestries embroidered with lions and saints. Every inch of the room spoke of legacy, of empires forged by sword and sea. With a composed breath, Charles raised his hand. The crown, he began, his voice steady, built empires that civilized the world. Our history is not one of shame, but of triumph. Let us not forget what the British monarchy gave the globe: order, progress, and trade. There was polite applause. A few heads nodded, cameras flashed, and then, silence. Because from the corner of the chamber, a figure stood. Ibrahim Traoré, military captain turned revolutionary leader, stepped forward. No crown, no scepter, no silk, just his uniform, worn, sharp, and unapologetically African. He didn't wait for permission. His voice cut through the room like the snap of a whip. You built empires, he said, eyes locked on Charles. No. You built graveyards. On African soil. With African hands. Gasps rippled through the audience. One aide dropped his pen. Charles blinked. But Traoré was just warming up. He walked slowly, like a lion approaching its prey, not with rage, but with purpose. You came with Bibles and bayonets. You called us savages. Then stole our land, our children, our gold. And now, he glanced at the portraits of old kings lining the walls. You call it civilization? Cameras zoomed. The hall, frozen. The tension, thick enough to choke. Charles straightened, lips thin. This is not the time for division, he muttered. We must look forward. Traoré didn't flinch. You looked forward too, he said. And saw only what you could take. His final words hit like thunder. Africa is not your legacy. It is your reckoning. The room did not applaud. The silence was louder than any cheer. The walls of Buckingham shimmered with generations of portraits, kings in ermine, queens in jewels, all staring down like ghosts guarding their stolen spoils. Yet on this day, it wasn't the grandeur of empire that held the room, it was the weight of a single man's voice. Traoré's words had cracked through centuries of imperial pride like a hammer to stained glass. King Charles remained still, his jaw clenched in silent disbelief. But the eyes of the room had already shifted, from crown to captain. Traoré turned slightly, facing the delegates seated behind Charles, ministers from Europe, former colonizers cloaked in modern diplomacy. You want to talk about peace? He asked, his tone sharp but measured. Then let's talk about memory. Because peace without truth is nothing but delay. He gestured toward a nearby tapestry depicting a map of the British Empire at its height. Africa, divided, dissected, devoured, lay there like a carcass. Every thread in that cloth, Traoré said, is soaked in blood. The blood of miners beaten for gold. The blood of children whipped for rubber. The blood of kings who resisted, like Samori Touré, like Shaka Zulu, who died with honor while your ancestors dined with silver cutlery stolen from their bones. The room shifted, chairs creaked, even the air felt heavier. Charles tried to salvage control. We cannot be held responsible for the past, he said, voice tightened. I was not there. Nor were you. Traoré's reply was a bullet of truth, but you benefit. And I live in its shadow. He walked toward a pillar etched with royal crests, ran his fingers along the stone. This marble was paid with ivory. This palace stands because villages in Benin were burned to the ground. And when we ask for reparations, you offer us lectures. A woman in the crowd wiped a tear. One man, a British MP, lowered his eyes in shame. Traoré locked eyes with Charles once more. I'm not here to beg. I'm not here to forget. I'm here to remind you, Africa remembers everything. He turned away. The silence was no longer awkward, it was sacred. Outside, London's rain painted the palace windows with streaks like the tears of history. Inside, the royal chamber had become a courtroom, only there were no robes, no gavels. Just memory, and reckoning. Traoré stood before the golden lectern, his tone solemn now, not fiery, but full of something far more dangerous, clarity. You claim the crown built empires, he said quietly, echoing King Charles's earlier boast. But let me tell you what the crown really built. He raised a single hand and began to count, not with fingers, but with names. Elmina, Gori, Zanzibar, Banjul, Kilwa. From west to east, from coast to heartland, you built dungeons and called them trade stations. You built gallows and called them order. You built schools that erased our names, churches that damned our gods, borders that cut tribes apart, and you called it civilization. The room was silent except for the sound of distant thunder. Whether it came from outside or from the weight of what was said, no one could tell. Even your silence, he continued, was designed. You don't speak of the Mau Mau in your textbooks. You skip over the famines engineered by your policies in India. You glorify Churchill, but not the corpses in Kenya who paid the price for his glory. Traoré took a step closer to the king, slow and deliberate. You say you weren't there. But your vaults still hold the gold. Your museums still hold our gods. Your banks still hold the interest, on centuries of theft. Charles tried to interject. We've done much to build new relationships. Traoré didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. You can't build a new house on bones. That line hit like a thunderclap. Even the interpreters paused. Traoré turned to the room. We've come not to negotiate scraps. We've come for justice. Real justice. Return the gold. Return the art. Return the truth. And maybe, just maybe, there will be peace. A flash of lightning lit up the sky. History was no longer buried. It stood in the room, wearing a captain's uniform. For a moment, it seemed even the gilded statues in the royal hall bowed their heads, not from respect, but from shame. King Charles remained motionless. The grandness of his throne, polished with centuries of conquest, looked suddenly fragile under the weight of Traoré's words. The air was heavy, not just with silence, but with revelation. Do you know what's worse than violence? Traoré asked, his voice slicing through the stillness. Indifference. He walked slowly past the line of dignitaries seated along the velvet benches, their faces betraying discomfort. You watched as Africa bled, its soil turned red, its children stolen, its culture erased, and you called it progress. He paused beside a mural depicting Queen Victoria, towering over maps of the world. You built an empire on this fantasy, that you were saviors. But we remember differently. His hand gestured to the crown insignia carved into the wall. That symbol doesn't mean honor to us. It means chains. It means ships loaded with black bodies. It means treaties made with ink and broken with blood. Charles shifted slightly in his seat. We've acknowledged our past, he murmured, attempting to maintain composure. Traoré stopped, his gaze sharp. Acknowledgement without action is cowardice dressed as diplomacy. There was a subtle murmur in the chamber. Even British journalists, so used to preserving royal narratives, could feel the ground shifting. This wasn't a debate. It was a dismantling. You ask us to move on, Traoré continued. Yet your vaults still hide the diamonds you never mined. Your corporations still exploit the lands you once colonized. Your soldiers still walk foreign deserts, pretending to keep peace, while guarding pipelines. He turned once more to the king. You crowned yourselves rulers of the world. But we're no longer your subjects. Traoré's words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. Truth, when spoken boldly, echoes louder than any drum of war. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was transformation. The chamber, now unsettled, trembled not from noise, but from the unraveling of illusion. Traoré stood before a symbol of centuries, and without raising his voice, he peeled back the mask that empires wear. You speak of duty, he said, locking eyes with King Charles. But the only duty you upheld was to your own wealth. Behind Traoré, a giant projection appeared, images of African children mining gold in sweat and blood. Your empires weren't built on trade, he said, his voice cutting like steel. They were built on stolen hands digging graves disguised as prosperity. A gasp rippled through the room. It wasn't just his words, it was the evidence. The numbers. The documents. The truth. Traoré paced slowly, then pointed to a crown encrusted with African diamonds, resting behind bulletproof glass. Every gem in that display is soaked in stories you tried to bury. But history remembers what pride denies. Charles tried to interject, his voice a trembling attempt at control. We've made strides to reconcile. You made gestures, Traoré cut in. While our lands were auctioned off. While you shook hands with those who loot us in your name. Tell me, what does reconciliation mean when the theft still continues? He walked toward a display showcasing the British Empire's global reach. You claim to civilize us. But civilization doesn't come from chains. The young African leader leaned in, voice low but thunderous. You want the world to believe the crown represents unity. But unity built on silence is nothing but compliance. And then he said it, slowly, deliberately. You didn't build an empire. You buried one. The room stilled. Cameras flashed. Pens halted. Even those loyal to the monarch felt the weight of a truth too long delayed. The myth cracked. And through it, the world saw not majesty, but manipulation. King Charles stood frozen, not by fear, but by the unfamiliar weight of being challenged with facts, not flattery. His court-trained composure was cracking under Traoré's relentless gaze. The silence that filled the hall wasn't peaceful, it was accusatory. Traoré didn't stop. Where were your voices when apartheid was law? When famine swept through nations your companies drained dry? He asked, not waiting for an answer. Where was the crown when African leaders were assassinated, with Western approval, to protect your mining interests? He raised a single finger. Each time we rose, you sent someone to push us back down. You didn't fear chaos, you feared independence. The room had become a courtroom, and Charles was on trial, not just for his legacy, but for centuries of silent complicity. Traoré gestured to the wall, where names of British colonies were engraved in gold. You call them former territories. We call them wounds. One journalist in the back whispered, he's saying what no one dares. Her colleague only nodded, eyes fixed on the unfolding reckoning. King Charles finally spoke. I was not born when most of these things happened. I inherited a role. And with that role, Traoré interrupted, you inherited responsibility. You sit on the throne built by history. You don't get to separate yourself from it now. There it was again, that sharp line Traoré mastered. Not a threat. A reminder. You want to be a symbol of unity? Traoré said. Then act like it. Return what was stolen. Speak against the puppet still looting in your name. Or admit what the world already suspects, that your silence is consent. A hush followed. But this time, it wasn't stunned, it was shaken. And in that silence, the truth finally had a voice. The press didn't wait. By the time King Charles retreated into the marble corridors of Buckingham's diplomatic wing, headlines were already circling the globe. Traoré confronts the crown, demands historical reckoning. Africa speaks back. Empires built on bones. In the royal chamber, Charles sat in silence, the tapestries and oil portraits offering no counsel. He had faced prime ministers, dictators, and dissenters. But never someone like Ibrahim Traoré, unbought, unafraid, and unrelenting. Traoré, meanwhile, stood on the embassy steps, facing a storm of microphones. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Our people were not savages needing civility, he said. We had universities while some of you were still sharpening swords. We had gold when your king still bartered for salt. A reporter shouted, are you accusing the monarchy of theft? Traoré turned slowly, his eyes calm. History already did. Cheers erupted from African students, activists, and even a few British citizens who had gathered outside. One elderly Ghanaian man whispered, my grandfather would have wept to see this. Inside, aides asked Charles if he wanted to issue a statement. He waved them away. What could he say? That the man was wrong? Traoré wasn't offering vengeance. He was offering a mirror. And it was one the Crown had avoided for centuries. Later that night, Buckingham Palace issued a generic press release: "We respect all voices seeking dialogue and progress." But the world saw the truth. Traoré had walked into the lion's den, and made the lion blink. The empire hadn't fallen. But its illusion of moral superiority had cracked, and that, sometimes, is how revolutions begin. The next day, across Britain, the aftermath settled like dust after a historic storm. Newspapers debated the moment, but the public had already chosen a side. Traoré's speech had gone viral. Clips flooded TikTok and YouTube. Young people mimicked his cadence. Old activists wept in silence. Even comedians paused their satire to reflect on the rawness of his words. In London's Parliament Square, protesters lit candles beside statues of Churchill and Mandela. Signs read, "We remember the gold. Graves are not foundations." Traoré spoke. We heard. Back in Burkina Faso, crowds flooded Ouagadougou. Schoolchildren marched with banners reading, "Dignity has a voice." Women ululated in joy. The streets pulsed with pride, a people long silenced now standing behind the man who had become their thunder. But the royal court wasn't finished. Behind closed doors, advisors pushed King Charles to respond more forcefully. "He's undermining the institution," one said. "He's stirring the past into flames." Charles, older than most of the staff combined, merely sipped his tea. "Then perhaps we should ask why the past still burns." Meanwhile, Traoré prepared for another speech, this time not in defense, but in declaration. He wasn't interested in apologies. He wanted restitution. Partnerships, not patronage. Trade, not theft. His team worked on the logistics for a multinational summit, to be held in Ouagadougou. Leaders from across Africa, South America, and Asia were invited. For the first time, the Global South would speak for itself. And as one aide whispered, looking at the rising flags outside the palace in Burkina Faso, it began the day Traoré faced the crown, and didn't flinch. The battle was no longer about words. It was about rewriting the rules of the world. In the days following Traoré's speech, silence reigned in Buckingham Palace. Not the silence of calm, but the kind that lingers before a reckoning. British media attempted damage control, spinning the encounter as misunderstood symbolism or a cultural divergence. But the internet wasn't buying it. Clips of Traoré's fierce stare, the pause before his final words, "on African graves," became a symbol. Artists painted murals in Lagos, Cape Town, and Accra. One piece, splashed across a wall in Nairobi, showed the crown sinking into a pit of golden skulls, while Traoré stood above, torch in hand, eyes blazing like a storm. And then came the academic world. Professors, researchers, and historians began citing Traoré's words in lectures. "He's not just a leader," one said in a Cambridge panel. "He's a living footnote to the empire's unfinished chapter." King Charles, once seen as a monarch of transition and reconciliation, now faced global scrutiny. Invitations to speak at international events began to slow. Even within the Commonwealth, whispers of reparation talks grew louder. Caribbean nations renewed demands for gold repatriation. South Africa hinted at opening colonial-era archives. Back in Burkina Faso, Traoré was unmoved by the storm he'd unleashed. In fact, he was building one. His administration launched a Truth and Trade initiative, a multinational policy demanding fair compensation for resources extracted during colonialism. Any nation unwilling to discuss reparative frameworks would face restricted access to African minerals. It wasn't revenge. It was reality catching up. International investors began to panic. Markets trembled. Gold prices surged. But Traoré's allies, nations long ignored or bullied, began to rally. Mali, Bolivia, Venezuela, and even Vietnam voiced support. The West had provoked a question for centuries: what happens when the looted remember? Traoré had become the answer. And the world, ready or not, was listening. A month after the confrontation, a historic summit was held, not in Geneva, not in London, but in Ouagadougou. Leaders from across the global south gathered beneath the sun-soaked skies of Burkina Faso's capital. No red carpets, no colonial flags, no champagne toasts. Just raw urgency and iron purpose. Traoré stood at the center, not as a host, but as a symbol. A symbol of reclamation. "We have nothing to prove to the empires of old," he began, voice steady, gaze unwavering. "But we have something to finish." The crowd erupted. Delegations from Latin America, Asia, and Africa raised fists, not in defiance, but in unity. It was the birth of a new alliance, the Sovereign Bloc. An economic and political coalition dedicated to ending exploitative trade, rewriting diplomatic protocol, and exposing imperialist mythologies still taught in Western schools. Across the ocean, the crown remained silent. King Charles, once admired for his soft-spoken diplomacy, had vanished from headlines. Behind palace walls, advisors scrambled to manage the PR catastrophe. But no op-ed, no BBC panel, no polished historian could bury what had been unearthed. Graves. Rich in gold. And stained in truth. The West now faced a new reality: Africa was no longer waiting for permission. It was leading. Not with borrowed institutions, but with ancestral clarity and future-driven resolve. For every mine once emptied, a manifesto was now drafted. For every body buried under empire's weight, a monument now rose. And in that summit, as the world watched via live stream, Traoré held up a small object. A royal coin from the colonial era. Its face bore the monarch's profile. Its back? A map of Africa. He dropped it onto the podium. "It belongs to the past," he said. "And we are done serving ghosts." The room fell into a hushed awe. Not because of drama. But because they all knew, this wasn't just a speech. It was a funeral. Not for Charles. For the illusion of empire. And as the world turned its gaze toward Africa once more, this time it wasn't for conquest. It was for answers.